Just want to take a few moments for those of you who aren't aware of the work of the Church's Conservation Trust to just say what's been happening and what we're up to during lockdown, coming out of lockdown, and how this time has affected us. So I've just actually come hot-footing it back from my first site visit to a church in a very long time. It was a fantastic opportunity to go to our beautiful church in Stansted Abbots, where I met the Secretary of State who was visiting, and we had a good social distance cup of tea and a look around the church, and managed to go up the tower as well, where we could see London off 19 miles in the distance as well. And it just brought home to me the importance of these buildings. That building in particular has got a fantastic Georgian interior, complete box pews, a triple-decker pulpit, and a very interesting selection of monuments. And some of the family whose monuments are there were actually present at the church with us as well, which demonstrates the power that the parish church has. It really defines the story of place. They're really precious things to the history of this country and the future. They define where we are and where we come from. And these buildings belong to everybody. Our work is dedicated to making sure that these buildings survive over the next generation and generations to come. And we wonder whether actually lockdown on the COVID issue has put more of a threat for some of these buildings, as there might be more that close for regular worship, and how do we look after them? From the church's conservation point of view, it's been a difficult time for us. We're facing a loss of somewhere around £500,000. So any donation you can make, join us, join our work, keep us going to make sure we can keep these buildings in good nick is a really good thing. We have 356 at the moment. We get around 2 or 3 more churches every year. Maybe we could take on more if we raise more money. That would be a great thing, and make sure that we can safeguard them. But we don't take them to ourselves and lock them away. We make sure that they are very much integrated into the heart of the local community, and we've got officers on the ground who support local communities look after to use and love their historic place of worship. So please support us, please join us. Minimum sign up for the newsletter, but come on, it would be great if you got on board with what we're doing and help save these fantastic churches. And they tell so many different stories from so many different perspectives. I've always said they're the most democratic of historic buildings because they tell a story of absolutely everybody, from the poorest to the wealthiest. And also today, I think Dr. Wells will actually demonstrate that they tell a story from the most refined tastes to the most crude as well. So we're looking forward to this lecture today. So Emma Wells is an ecclesiastical and architectural historian specialising in late medieval and Reformation parish churches and cathedrals. She has a deep knowledge and love of these buildings, as you can see from her social media posts as well. She's the programme director for the postgraduate diploma in Parish Church Studies, which is undertaken in partnership with the CCT at the University of York. So there's always good opportunities for you to learn, and you can sign up for her course there. And next year she'll be releasing a book, Heaven on Earth, The Lives and Legacies of the World's Greatest Cathedrals, which we can't wait to see. So Emma's a well-experienced lecturer and has been lecturing us on behalf of us for some time as well over lockdown. So without further ado, here's the naughty bits of parish churches. Dr. Wells.
Thank you ever so much, Peter. Just going to share my screen here and play. Okay, great. Here we go. So is everyone strapped in comfortably? In that case, we shall begin. First of all, I must point out that today's talk isn't going to be a load of old historic smut. It isn't going to be just an hour of typical British shriveled seaside humour. I do apologise to those who are here for that, though of course there will be tinges, so do not worry. What I'm actually here to do today is unravel and explore the complex meanings behind what we initially perceive as the dirty and tawdry images often found lurking across the interiors and exteriors of our parish churches, and indeed some cathedrals will be thrown in there too. Gazing at the inside or indeed outside of any historic church, your eyes are likely to encounter strange beasts, frolicking figures, twisted foliage and all sorts, staring back at you from doorways, windows, friezes, corbel tables, roof bosses and stained glass. Although plenty are just hidden enough to fool the eye. What are these strange images? Was the period simply rife with satire, or do these hold deeper meanings? So today we're going to have a look at the types and the themes which seem to occur and reoccur, and attempt to explain just what just what the heck is going on, really, in a very introductory sense. Just why are our churches plastered with such supposed naughtiness? In simple terms, we don't know. I know that's very much the church historian's cop-out, and it's one I'm going to embrace with both arms today. But simply, we don't. We could end the paper there, we just don't know. But we can theorise, and much of the interpretations that I'm going to provide you with are just that, sort of theories. Firstly, I think we can all agree that these strange pictures allowed artists' and patrons' imaginations to run wild, they were given free rein, as they often delighted in poking fun at humanity. And don't we still? We'll see that at the end of today's talk. So we're going to start with a rather light-hearted theme. Don't worry, I'm just easing you in here. First up are the absurd images proliferating across windows, corbels, portals, anywhere you can imagine. And those are strange animals, so I'm calling this theme monkeying around. But most often they are apes, and that's why. And they form the sort of scatological, sexual, bizarre, or just plain silly artworks that populate a surprisingly large range of medieval art in its marginal spaces. Column capitals, misericords, buster page manuscripts, window borders, the bases of statues, and so on and so forth. So what we're seeing here are the images that might be perceived as lewd or crude or odd or strange, and they would be if they were the centerpiece or the main image of a window, a manuscript or whatever. But they're seen as acceptable when placed in the corners of a window or a corbel or down the bottom of a page, whatever it might be. Why this is the case isn't entirely clear. Some scholars have suggested that they were a kind of way to provide images for both official and popular and folk culture, or as teaching images to illustrate sin and evil, as a counterpoint to virtue and good. Certainly an example of a more complex artistic practice than a one-off pay shot to paymaster, or being angry with one's boss and showing him. A great example exists in the north nave aisle of York Minster, in the famous pilgrimage window, which dates to around 1330. The window is named after the depiction of the crucifixion in its main lights, which is sited above male and female pilgrims flanking St. Peter. But entangled in the margins of the window runs a furore of bizarre, let's just call it. The eccentricity and chaos make it difficult for the eyes to set upon one element. There's a brawling couple dashing by, the wife grabbing her husband by the ear, as though he were a naughty schoolboy, to a tiny squirrel attempting to catch a monkey who sits unruffled, peering intently into a round glass vial filled to the brim with, yes, cold, stale urine, and that's what we see here. We have another monkey doctor who's examining his sick patient, aping the doctors of the era, and the humility and chastity of St. Peter above. And from then on, everything continues backwards. We have a fox preaching to a cock. We have another who steals a goose pursued by a woman. We have an archer and an owl, and they complete this curious set. But interestingly, below, there's a row of apes carrying out a funeral procession, and that's what we can see across the screen. And the funeral procession is headed by a primate bell ringer. He's joined by a cross-bearer and 4 pallbearers who cart a bier above their shoulders. And this is a mimicry, an imitation of the Virgin Mary's funeral, which was an apocryphal tale. So as Bernard of Clairvaux asked, to what purpose are those unclean apes? How should we be reading these very strange and curious images? One of the most curious marginal motifs was the use of monkeys. They're often represented doing human-like activities or aping human behaviour. They might be playing instruments or games or hunting, eating and drinking, but the overall purpose was to suggest the folly of man. In the Christian tradition, apes were thoughtless, parodies of humanity, displaying gluttony, vanity and foolishness. So they were sort of powerful reminders of the potential for all men and women to sort of get involved in and engage in depraved acts and sin. The monkey physicians also mimic the medical profession, so the sort of widespread disdain for doctors of physic, as it was felt that only Christ could cure the souls of man. The foxes too have allegorical meanings, usually the consequences of lapses in devotion, and they appear throughout medieval art. So the border theme therefore has a deliberate and conscious choice by the artist. And in fact, we'll see that likely, or we perhaps think that is a likely recurrent theme throughout all these strange images. And what's very interesting about why they exist, and the more that we'll see today, is that come the 14th century, when Lollardist preachers rallied against idolatry, there was considered confusion over whether these type of images were considered illicit or were they licit. In that case, are these odd, strange images, these marginal images, contrasting against the main themes, why were they targeted if they were licit? Why would they be such a prevalent part of the church decorative infrastructure if they were illicit? So the term marginal art is therefore quite unhelpful, and you'll see why throughout this talk. So next up, what I like to call the many mooning men of the Middle Ages. The 12th century parish church of All Saints in Easton-on-the-Hill, just outside of Stamford in Northamptonshire, features a wealth of architectural styles from Norman through to Neo-Gothic. Yet as you approach the south porch, you may be shocked to find the 15th century stone gargoyle perched on the side of the tower, which shows the bare behind of a man bending over for all to see. Local legend has it that his proud posterior is pointing in the direction of the stonemason of Peterborough Cathedral in protest at not being paid. These types of carvings can be found adorning the exteriors of churches across the country in the form of gargoyles, grotesques, and also as ornamental frieze figures. Before continuing though, a short explanation, which is quite important, of the differences between grotesques and gargoyles. So gargoyles are often misused as a generic term for grotesque carvings, whereas actually what they are is a decorative carving with a water spout that preserves the stonework so that the water spout diverts the flow of water essentially away from the roof and walls and down to the ground below. On the other hand, grotesques, while they're similarly they are stone carvings and sculptures, but they're much more of an ornamental or artistic function. So they don't have a spout in simple terms. Although it's not entirely clear when this bold artwork first emerged, it appears to have coincided with the emergence of the Gothic style, or perhaps more specifically the Perpendicular era, so late 14th to 16th century. The majority, though, seem to date from around the 14th century. And these include several other examples, as we can see here. And also they include what we'll call today is male contortionists, so men bent into strange positions, essentially, usually showing their behind. But several other mooning grotesques can be found, as I say, across the British Isles, again, usually around the date from the same period. The example at Easton features, though, a rather brazen pose, and indeed these two. We see this type of pose with bent over, we see this at All Saints Oakham as well, bent over, bottom in the air, legs spread apart, but with the head peering round from the right, and the strategically placed water spout, the hole, inserted for diverting rainwater in an anatomical sense, I suppose, rather than to illustrate, though, any anatomical features. And so his proud posterior officially serves its actual practical purpose. It's hardly surprising then that mischievous masons could not resist the urge to use such orifices for these dual and satirical purposes, and that by the time of the Eastern carving in the 15th century, they were certainly embracing the humour of the secular world without feeling affront. But interestingly, rather interestingly indeed, most of these odd creatures seem to be showing their scrotums, but very rarely the penis is shown. Alex Woodcock, he discussed this in his PhD and suggested that what we might call tongue or mouth pullers, we can see that at St Mary's at West Knoll, they seem to use their tongue in replacement of the penis. So we're essentially a polite version of something a little bit more taboo. But explaining the general actual purpose and what the heck is going on here, what are these impish figures doing, is a little bit trickier. There's certainly ample evidence that people mooned each other during the Middle Ages. It was a sign of insult. We see this in the Miller's Tale, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, 14th century, where characters Alison and Nicholas trick Absalom into kissing her behind, though admittedly the gesture's not quite the same as mooning someone. Copious interpretations of these figures have therefore been offered by many, many scholars. And these theories that they've come to include as warnings to sinners, as guardians of the church, symbols of temptations perhaps, attention grabbers, and so on. Perhaps the reason for this is that there's no, or seems to be, no single all-encompassing function for them. But a theory which occurs time and again is that gargoyles and grotesques were litters, if you will, survivals of pagan beliefs, superstitions, cultures, and folklore that the church permitted to persist alongside Christian subjects, a sort of imaginative play that was tolerated by the church. The consequence of this is that many believe the carvings to be ultimately protective or apotropaic, to reflect the contrast between a world outside the church beset by the devil and sin, as opposed to the sanctity contained within its walls. Think of the church as the kingdom of heaven on earth. The idea is then that these figures were placed to deflect the evil spirits by drawing their attention to these insulting characters. So they wouldn't be allowed in because they would be, looking at them too much, essentially, too drawn in by these. So perhaps the Mooner then is proudly cocking a snook at the devil, that we may equally be intended to shock, to amuse, or act as a counter and balance to the religious. Perhaps, therefore, they are indeed to defend the building from ever-present evil. And the fact that these were also supposedly used by priests during sermons or even for teaching may further agree with this idea. But of course, we must be careful not to overinterpret these types of images and any of the types of images we look at today. Perhaps, in fact, the function and origins behind them is not quite as complicated as we might want to believe. And they were just simply a common motif during the medieval era. In fact, we might just even say that many were likely just a way of showing one's arse to the authorities or their morals, a sort of FU, if you will, in stone form. Perhaps, though, that also poses problems, as a lot of these theories do. But we must remember, though, that the images of churches are not simply rendered holy by their attachment to the church. My point here being, just because these are carvings on a church doesn't mean they're any more sacred or less sacred, vice versa. So on to the next theme. Among the 14th century misericords at Chichester Cathedral is an energetically captured carved scene of a musician with a sitar, a sort of early violin, who's in the midst of stealing a kiss from a dancing woman or a posture maker. But that is actually rather tame in comparison to the misericords seen here. Misericords are the carved timber, usually oak, and these are the undersides or ledges of tip-up or hinge seats, on which standing ecclesiastics could rest their bottoms in the choir of English cathedrals and collegiate churches during the divine office, of which there were quite a few. They first appeared in churches around the early 13th century, with the majority dating from the mid-13th to the late 15th centuries. And the Latin word, they come from the Latin word meaning pity. The name literally translates to their function, a demonstration of mercy, as they were designed to support the sitter in an upright position. But the undersides depict an assortment of figural carvings that could be displayed or concealed depending on where you position the seat. This may explain because they were only seen by medieval clerics. The carvings seldom displayed sacred images of Christ, but in fact, rather vernacular subjects, scenes from daily life, customs, human beliefs that included a great sense of fun, freedom, and vigor, as you can see here. Not surprisingly, such scenes often prove rather amusing and intriguing, particularly as the carvings were intended for an exclusive sacred area of the church, the choir, the most sacred, really. So what was their purpose? Why did the church permit such apparently non-religious subjects at the centre of its devotional hub? Well, subjects vary widely, but we again see many of the same naughty yet allegorical representations occurring here as elsewhere in this paper, such as temptations of lust, apes with urine flasks again, the green man being the man's face sculpted, surrounded by leaves or made of foliage, birds and beasts, abstract foliage designs, and medieval folk tales and legends. But what's more, many scenes can be interpreted as sermons come to life, and they were used to instruct common folk on principles of doctrine. perhaps. Yet, while certain figural scenes may at first appear secular, they were actually reminders to their ecclesiastical viewer of his professional responsibility to educate the masses against temptations to sin. The profane and debauched images of these sexual lives of lay people, as we can see, would prompt the medieval cleric to shun women, have self-control, and fear the wrath of God. So those images that we saw earlier of, and indeed the more there are, of women thrashing men or those being made to accept the advances of men, as we saw, were not commentaries on domestic violence, but as Paul Hardwick suggests, they were actually representations of medieval fears that religious men had over letting women get the upper hand, so that they could possibly step out of place, so to speak, and therefore disrupt the so-called natural order of church and life. Essentially, I think it's best to think in those sort of public service announcements or billboards in miniature form, providing warnings or diversions for the clergy from the temptations of man, much like doom paintings and many other devotional wall paintings found in the naves of churches did so and warned the lay congregation. So, okay, here we go, now on to the plain old filth. The 12th century Church of St. Mary and St. David at Kilpeck in Herefordshire had some extraordinary carvings, including writhing snakes and mysterious beasts. But most extraordinary of all is one of England's best preserved examples of a shilling a gig, a term first coined, it appears, in the mid-19th century, though the origins of the name are disputed, yet thought likely be Irish. These sexually explicit figurative stone carvings, sometimes found on the outside of walls or corbels of medieval churches, sometimes found as misericords, depict a naked woman in a seated position with her legs open, wide open, openly exposing her genitalia, of course. Examples are most often found above doorways and windows in Northern Europe, predominantly Ireland and Britain, but also a few locations elsewhere in Europe. Such as here, the Contortionist capital, a little bit like we saw earlier, at the monastery of San Pedro in Spain. Determining their date and place of origin has proven rather difficult, with many scholars disagreeing over the origins of the figures, and many believed to have been reused from previous older structures. However, they appear on churches between the 11th and 17th centuries and were likely carved first in France or Spain. So throughout history, though, archaeologists tended either to ignore them entirely, or they labelled them as lewd, barbarous, or repulsive images that no one should ever see. Museums, as a result, kept them locked away, safely from any public eyes, we just can't bear to look at them. But only in the past few decades did academics as well as artists turn their attention to these rather intriguing carvings. So what were these naked females doing on the exteriors of churches? And interiors, in fact, and not only naked, but openly displaying their genitalia. Well, there are a number of theories which have waxed and waned in popularity over the years. Though shilling-a-gigs may seem erotic in nature, it's doubtful these carvings were ever really intended to arouse and were actually perhaps ancient goddesses, so pre-Christian pagan symbols of fertility, which were incorporated into the newcomer Christian church. In part, this is based on descriptions of Irish deities such as the Caeli, who, like the medieval exhibitionists, the males and female, were described as hag-like. Barbara Freitag argues that they belong to the realm of folk deities, and so given their crude form, shilling-a-gigs, she suggests, were produced by local amateur carvers and therefore associated with life-giving powers, birth and death, the renewal of life, like we think of as Christ in the Christian church, therefore presiding over certain departments of life, perhaps even, as I say, the goddess of creation or Mother Earth herself. Others have proposed that they are copies of French sculptures put on Romanesque churches as warnings against lust and warders or protectors from evil, against moral corruption, sort of like protective talismans or good luck charms, hence their positions over entranceways. As noted, regardless of whether this was the case, throughout the past, embarrassed or high-minded churchgoers and indeed clerics removed them, covered them, even destroyed them, as they were viewed as essentially offensive. And in fact, this recently happened at All Saints in Buncton, where between the 10th and 11th of November in 2004, this figure, this Sheila na gig, was in fact destroyed. It's been in the church since probably the early 1100s, only to be completely eradicated one evening with a chisel. The story goes that one of the parishioners wasn't rather happy to see it go, mainly because they thought it was pagan. Also they suggested, and therefore the damage may have been done seemingly because of its supposed pagan nature. But my personal favourite interpretation of the Sheila na gigs is actually by Anthony Weir, and he suggests that they were a kind of dirty postcard, copied again from Romanesque originals to warn people, notably pilgrims, of the various horrors connected with femaleness in Britain. He even suggests that they might be apprentice pieces, which is possible given many are, I suppose we could call them a crude realism, somewhat poor workmanship, though that's disputed, of course. Alex Woodcock adopts the term liminal carvings as well, recognising that the locations and meanings of the carvings can be thought of as liminal or on the threshold. Of course, the issue here is that we don't always find them on windows or doorways, liminal locations. They are found in other places. They do, however, seem to appear in what we could term weak spots in the construction of a building. And this makes a more convincing argument for the liminal perception, as again, they might be warding off evil, apotropaic in nature. In this case, we could think of them similar to the many etchings and carvings that we might find inscribed around doorways, fireplaces and windows, even in medieval vernacular, secular buildings and houses, often thought to be protective markings. So are we seeing a similar practice here, perhaps? But the problems with these interpretations are numerous. The main point is that Sheila na gigs are predominantly found in rural churches, predominantly in remote agricultural areas, where apart from obvious Christian iconography, they represent usually the only form of artistic imagery. So their close relationship with nature and a reverence for traditional customs suggest they might just have been a sort of guarantor of crops, animals and humans. So again, we're coming back to this idea of the renewal of life or birth. Now let's have a look too at this figure at Painswick, which again has been referred to as a Sheila na gig, even by academics. But the truth of the matter is that male figures, well, they didn't really have a generic name like the female figures, although Jack Roberts coined them as Sean na gigs, i.e. the male Sheila. And other examples of non-Sheila figures being called Sheilas include hands in lap figures and monstrous exhibitionists. But this seems to distort the evidence, especially for Leicestershire, where there are no known, I believe, female exhibitionists, with the possible exception of a figure up in the tower of the church at Borough on the Hill. But such a male figure is one of a great number, such the male figures we can see here, one of a great number of decorative heads and figures, and we see quite a few of these in the complex nave roof sculpture at Claybrook at the bottom there on the left. Most of these carvings are seemingly anonymous, regal or noble heads, but the positioning of this particular carving is interesting. It was difficult to see. It's tucked away at the western end of the nave and quite small to the unaided eye. But while Anthony Weir has identified a number of French Romanesque male figures who are apparently, well, pleasuring themselves, let's just say, the Claybrook figure is self-evidently moralistic, perhaps even the Eglinton one we see here too. This is reinforced by the nearby presence of a female half figure at Claybrook, there was a female half figure who's revealing her breast essentially opposite him. So she's presumably intended to be what we know as harlot, and the male is doing what he wants to himself as he looks upon her, perhaps. Similarly, in All Saints Church at Hereford on the 15th century rood screen, on the 15th century rood screen at Bratton Clovely, and even Norwich Cathedral's roof bosses, where apparently Noah has been shamed, we see a further range, let's just call it male exhibitionism. The All Saints figure it's quite accessible to see now due to the installation of a floor to the new restaurant. But when originally carved, the rood man would have been quite difficult to spot. A theory is that he is the woodcarver himself, getting revenge for non-payment for his work at the church. So again, another sort of FU, if you will, or just simply having fun with his artistry. Perhaps we could even argue he was a bit of a good luck charm. Then there's the figure in the Margam Stones Museum near Port Talbot. It's mentioned as a possible corbel dating to the 15th or 16th century. However, as you can see from the image, the figure is a lot more complex and indeed appears to be a gargoyle with a water spout. The figure is sitting on his bum, holding his cheeks apart where the water comes out, with its legs splayed and up in the air. And the figure also could be said to be what I will call a man-at-stool figure, which I'll come on to a little bit more in a minute. And then there's those such as Croft-on-Tees. The carving's quite crude and considerably differs from the rest of the carving found in the church. Yet there's seemingly a small, deeply incised slit for what we may assume is a vagina, which is quite narrow and not immediately obvious. However, the figure has been described, and even recently, as Romano-British and indeed male. The evidence for the figure being male is due apparently to the to the damage around the navel of the figure. It does look a little bit of a phallic symbol there. But no mention is made of the nipples or breasts on the figure. I suppose it could still be male, which also can be seen here in the photograph. But given that the figure has a rather deep cleft between the legs, which extends upwards, it seems more likely to correlate to a typical Sheila and a gig. But I will let you be the judge of that one. Now, similar to Sheila's are perhaps what I believe is the most fascinating of these rude carvings, the bizarre male exhibitionist theme, as we'll call him, with his posterior waving in the air, proudly defecating on all who walk beneath him or past him, or the man at stool taking a. We find this scatological imagery, or anus showers, as they are also lovely termed, yes, really, all over. We find them on misericors and corbels and grotesques. Now, here we have the Felmersham corbel. It's clearly what is known as an anus shower, or a variation on that theme. And he's sticking his tongue out, but appears also to be licking his anus. Lovely. A mooning man in himself is perhaps just as amusing, but this type of mooning man, this detail, this position, is a little bit more shocking. I suppose they fit more with the types of mooning men we looked at earlier, but I'm going with a different theme here. Art historian Michael Camille, though he debates whether we should regard these scatological antics as simply carnivalesque, or whether they could be construed as examples of rough music. And these types of images were used by communities to vent their displeasure towards social miscreants, so cheating merchants, adulterers, wife beaters, all the baddies of the community essentially, in a sort of similar manner to the misericords we saw earlier, so teaching the lay folk what not to do, to be good essentially. Yet mooning is not simply comical. Part of the humour is the implied insult, or in the case of farting or anything else, it's just bad manners. And yet also the person performing the insult, they're also being manipulated, at least by themselves. They're manipulating their bodies. Both male and female, the gesture has some self-evident sexual connotations, which imply subordination as well. Interestingly though, other scholars have suggested they reveal a more homoerotic or deviant male sexuality as a kind of foil for heterosexual themes of pregnancy or copulation. However, what we can also deduce is that occasionally their purpose was to signal the especially holy parts of the church, such as the position of important altars, shrines, or chapels. Due to the fact that they're located among the less immediately visible parts of the church building, usually, some scholars have argued that these unseen areas became dens of artistic iniquity for marginalized subjects. So they certainly offer a curious commentary on the mentality of medieval craftsmen. Accordingly, there is little doubt that these men at stool, or whatever we want to call them, were located closer to eye level than some of the other images we've seen for shock value. They were perhaps there to inspire reflection, the withholding of temptation, and to illustrate that the repetition of such incongruous behaviour would lead to one's own spiritual distortion. So listener, take note. Therefore, all in all, as many scholars suggest, after analysing all of these types of images, perhaps the most important point to make is that there are a multiplicity of possible meanings that can be taken from them, all of these that are mentioned. Therefore, the meanings have the propensity to shift depending on the context in which they were viewed. Essentially, the nature of the naughty image is in the eye of the devotional beholder. And indeed, it appears it still is, given that our churches and cathedrals are still replete with more modern versions of this religious ribald humour, as we can see here. Thank you very much.
Emma, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Do have a look at the comments, Clan. Thank you so much to everyone watching, because those comments are brilliant. And thank you already for the questions. So we're now going to move into question time. So do post any questions you have, and we'll put those to Emma now. Before we go on though, if you did enjoy that, please do consider making a donation to our work. As I said, these lectures are completely free to enjoy and watch. We record them and make the recordings available to watch for free as well. So do either make a donation on our website, the link is on our video description, and that's completely secure, or text CCT to 70331 to make a gift of £3. Now, Emma, let's get into some of the questions, because there's been quite a few already coming in. So the first question we've had come in, Emma, are these mooning characters ever female apart from the Sheila gigs?
I'm trying to think. I believe that there are some. Now, this is the problem, because if we don't see a penis, are they male or female? So as I've said, we sometimes see a scrotum, sometimes we don't. So I think the issue here is that we can't gender them. So I think focusing on their gender is perhaps we shouldn't do. But they do seem to be both. But whether that's just the nature of the carving is another one. But technically, let's just say yes.
Thanks, Emma. So I'm going to move on quite quickly, because we've got quite a few coming in. So several of the photos are from the same part of the country. So Glinton, Oakham, Rutland, etc. Is it more prevalent in that area?
It seems to be. Now, again, we're into a completely different question here, because we're looking at survival rates, etc., etc. But it depends what theme we're looking at. I would say so. There seems to be. So perhaps that does suggest something, or perhaps we might have another interpretation there. If we're looking more at, if we go along the theme of pagan or folk deities, then that might go somewhere to explaining, particularly in the more rural areas. And I said they seem to be linked to more very rural, agriculturally focused areas. So yes, and perhaps that is why. Let's go with that theme. Yes.
Thanks, Emma. So you mentioned about sort of where carvings were in the church, and they may become sort of dens of artistic iniquity. And we've had a question come in. So is there a difference between this imagery on the inside versus the outside the church, or the threshold of church perimeters?
Well, yes and no. This was one of the theories that has been put forth, in that they seem to be over entranceways, let's just say over thresholds a lot of the time, which would explain them being apotropaic, as being sort of talismans, good luck charms, fighting away evil and all that. But we find them in other odd places too. And indeed, if we're working along the same lines that these are all very similar, they are in, let's say, more blatant areas too. So I think there is something into that. We could also, because some of them are found on rood screens and carvings near rood screens, I would term that as a boundary. I would term that as a threshold as well. There's been, Jacqueline Young's done a great study on this. So I think there is something in that theme, and that whether it's interior or exterior, they are sort of apotropaic in some respects, yeah.
Thanks, Emma. Are the monkeys aping humans in windows, or in medieval art generally, where the term comes from, do you think?
I believe possibly. I believe there might be something in that. Now, don't quote me on that. I don't know the etymology of aping, but that seems to be, it seems to go back quite far, because that's exactly what they were doing, was aping human behavior. I always call it aping, suggesting the folly of man. Everything that's wrong with man, you could end up as a monkey, essentially, they're saying, yes.
Brilliant. And one of the pictures you showed, so the top picture from the Cathedral of San Tugdual looks like a real person. Is it known if they depicted real people?
Well, again, we can't say yes, I suppose. But as I've said, sometimes there is the inference that they might be the carver himself might be the artist. So that's certainly a possibility. I mean, it could be with much medieval imagery. Were they basing them on themselves? We see that particularly with images of architecture that's based on, contemporary. So let's go with yes.
So we had sort of some of the corbel sons, and it looked like where their legs were sort of coming over their heads. Are these acrobats similar to the corbel of Our Lady's tumble at Exeter Cathedral?
Well, possibly. Again, I feel like I'm not giving any straight answers here, so I do apologise. But again, possibly. And this is the point: is that I think we need to be careful to overinterpret anything. And if they're in some images, obviously, as the one that we're referring to, that is in a more biblical sense, is in a more specifically theological, doctrinal sense. But they could also be used as a sort of aside, as marginalia too. So we find them all interweaved on their own, interweaved. So yes and no.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on Sheilas as symbols of a return to the womb, the mother church, given that they are often over the door?
Interesting theory. I'm not against that. I would go again. I did sort of push the idea that it was symbols of fertility, renewal, rebirth, and that would go right along with that. The problem comes that they are also found in different areas. So does that negate the theory? Perhaps not. But I think it's certainly. But I suppose the dependence is on the age of whether they were reused or not. Essentially, is what I'm saying. If they were, are they remnants of the sort of, we'll call it pagan, just for the sake of it, earlier pagan deities that have now gone with Christians, or are they just reused, or are they there alongside? It depends on the site as well.
Thanks, Emma. Do you think that these sculptors may have been adolescents?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, they were. That's the point. And they were itinerant, so they were going all around and seeing other people doing these things, and then they were, going away and working on the next church. So they could create a interesting carving, leave it there, bugger off to the next one, essentially. So yes.
Brilliant. Are these seen on cathedrals or just churches?
Both. Both. We saw examples today of both. So yes.
You talked about anus showers, but we've had a question come in here. Could the anus licking be an allusion to cleanse yourself, i.e. confess your sins? A long shot, I know, but...
No, I think... long shot. I think that's great. Essentially, that is what they're doing. If, again, we go with these theories, it's warnings against temptations of lust and all that sort of thing, warnings against what's not to do. Cleanse yourself in that way if you wish, then yes. I think it's sort of satirical and poking fun at humanity, or perhaps, let's just say, if it's on misericords or whatever, it is poking fun at layfolk a little bit. It is looking down at your nose a little bit. So yes, I think that's great.
And I know, so the next question is sort of, could the group of figures at Norwich be a representation of a drunken Noah being exposed by one of his sons? And I think that's what the carving is, isn't it, of Noah being exposed?
Yeah, I believe that's what it is. You have to look and look again and think, no, that's not his leg. And it is what you think. So yes, and it's a really interesting composition of that particular scene. So yes, exactly, yes.
Are any of the carvings that we see in some of the churches known to be from pre-Christian times?
Well, this is what I was saying about whether they are or not, whether they are reused or not. And that there's some evidence that perhaps they are, and some that they are, but they seem to go on later as well. So what's the answer? Whether they are, as I call them, sort of litterings, remnants from pre-Christian beliefs, perhaps, but that doesn't really explain them going on to the 15th century. So it's very interesting. Perhaps the meaning migrates and evolves.
Yeah. Is the location of Sheila gigs on houses, and in one case on a holy well, does that suggest one reason for their existence than another theory, do you think?
what I would say is, again, when I alluded to the protective markings and etchings, carvings that you find on doorways, around fireplaces and windows, etc., it was a common practice to protect oneself, essentially. And so perhaps, you know, if we're going with that theme, that would make sense. We see them over entranceways. They're, you know, taking the eyes of the devil to them so that they could, you know, so he's not interested in the church and the kingdom of heaven within. So that would really work for that theory, I think. But how common they are in secular areas, I'm not as aware.
Yeah, and and you mentioned and you showed some of the depictions from Spain, and we've had a question here though asking, is there a link between the arrival of these motifs with the returning pilgrims from Santiago de Compostela, an area of Spain where such corbels are common? I understand that the patron of Kilpec had made that pilgrimage. Incidentally, we have an urban Sheila on St. Michael's, Malton, and there is one in Oxford too.
I think that's a difficult question to answer because possibly so. I think the point is here that they are that Masons were itinerant, particularly those that worked on parish churches. So it certainly could have been in Santiago and then come back to Kilpec or vice versa or whatever it was. So you might, what I'm saying is, you might have Masons that were working on several different churches across Europe, and in fact we did have that. We know that. So that could have occurred, but does that explain them everywhere else? We don't know.
And we've had here, thanks for all the questions, everyone. Would the placement under misericords be because you'd not put something sacred under someone's bottom?
No, because you do get things that are sacred under people's bottoms.
Yeah.
At the church. So, you know, I think it's more of just a way to hide the sort of ribald humour that was, because they're still on show. They're still very much on show. So I think there's slightly different reason.
There are some, I know there's some really interesting hidden ones. So if you go into the Lady Chapel at Ely Cathedral and around all the niches where the monks or pilgrims would have sat, if you look, obviously when a monk got bored, if you look up at some of them, some on the outside where they're facing the chapel, they're smiling, but then on the inside, the faces are poking fun at the person sitting down. So there are some really great things. And I think sometimes, Emma, I don't know if you think so, but you know, if clergy got bored, I think it would have distracted them having some of these things around.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're in church for a long time. That's the point. There's divine offices going for a long time, which is why you have them in the first place. So I think they're there to rest your bum, essentially, and rest your eyes on something funny. Yeah, absolutely. And
this is quite an interesting question. Is it likely to be the same group of itinerant stonemasons creating these grotesques, or just is it a style or imagery adopted by stonemasons across the country?
Difficult question, really. Yes and no. I think certainly some of them will perhaps have been carved by the same people, and they were moving around. But at the same time, it seems to be a very common motif all over. So we probably can't have just one. Well, we can't have one group of stonemasons. They were all over. So yes and no, essentially. Yeah.
And another question that's coming about misericords. Most interesting, I don't understand how misericords could be for teaching the people, given that they were in the choir, which was usually only for monks and the clergy only.
No, not teaching the people themselves, teaching the clergy, providing teachings to the clergy on how to teach the lay folk, let's just say. So it's teachings on the temptations of lust that man could fall into. So it's essentially giving them guidance on what could happen to the lay folk and what to sort of steer them away from as well. But it's more warnings. It's warnings to both sides, but warnings particularly to the clerics, really. Yeah.
I think it's a really difficult question, but why did the use of this imagery stop?
Well, I mean, I suppose that, yeah, this would take an entire several lectures to go through that. I mean, it depends. It depends where it stops. I mean, it doesn't entirely stop. You still see this sort of fun, satirical nature in carvings carrying on throughout past the Reformation, etc. We still see it a little bit later on. So I think more so when the break with Rome hit, particularly in England, and the Reformation started, and I was talking about what were illicit and what were illicit when it came to the Lollards, for example. This is the point. It's this kind of tongue-in-cheek nature of the clergy that was slowly becoming out of hand and that people were trying to reform against. Then we get to the Reformation, the entire Reformation, and that's why, I think, because everything changed. That was essentially why. So it just wasn't as common. There weren't as many, you know, all of this going on and all this money. So many reasons.
Do you think that, so you showed some images there from York Minster with the carvings there. Do the York Minster stonemasons, you know, if they faithfully replaced the ones they found, or are they basically new creations?
I believe some of them are recreations, but quite a few of the very funny ones are entirely new creations based on, I mean, there's all sorts. There's ones based on some of the stonemasons themselves. There's some based on oh gosh, there's an archbishop somewhere, you know, there's everything you can imagine. There's the astronaut, you know, so it's just a mix of, they use, you know, themselves, and then they also have been inspired by early ones.
I think that's fascinating. I think that's absolutely brilliant that they're doing that. Is our modern culture regarding nudity very different, do you think, from the 14th century?
Oh, that's a very open question, I suppose. Yes and no. I think, well, I think that's interesting. I think I would bow to a historian of sex perhaps more and that kind of humour than myself. But considering we tend to think of churches as very reverential places, solemn. I don't think we would put these images in there now and be quite so open with our sexuality, perhaps. Perhaps we're moving back to that. So perhaps they were more open. Perhaps they were more open about the human body, because the human body, you know, reflected much more, when we have science now, but reflected much more of the humours and everything like that, and how the world worked. So perhaps that is where it comes from, but I am no sex historian, unfortunately.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions, and we're gonna have to call it a day. But I'm just going to do these last few questions, Emma. Are there any differences between different denominations, such as Roman Catholic or Protestant churches, with this kind of interpretation?
Well, much of what we've been looking at is obviously Catholic, because these are earlier medieval and into the medieval. But we do, again, I'm not a historian of any of the later Protestant churches. But then again, later Protestantism, I think there are satirical images within later Protestant churches, much later. But again, what we're looking at here is largely Catholic, technically, of course. Yeah.
And is there evidence that these, any of these were actually recorded in church records being created?
No, I mean, you don't really get that type of detail. You get, you know, how much people were paid, how much stone was used, and things like that. I mean, you do get, there are parchments that have, you know, tracery of windows and things like that, but I don't really think anything survives to say, oh look, we were going to create this and we made a drawing of it, essentially. So
yeah. And finally, I think that's a nice one to finish on. Are mermaid carvings a form of Sheila gigs, do you think?
I mean, I've seen this, and there is one, and I can't think what it's from, where the two tails are going up. Some people say yes and some people say no. Again, it depends on the form of the Sheila. Depends whether they're exposing anything. So I think sometimes they possibly could be, but they don't seem to be. I mean, we get Sheilas, we get mermaids really quite far back in Durham Cathedral Chapel. There's one of the earliest mermaid carvings on one of the capitals there. But that's not sort of sexual, if you want to call it that, in any sense of the word. It's not no type of Sheila or exhibitionist or exposed. So I think it's a theme on the theme. Let's go with that. Yeah.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you everyone for your questions. Now, before you all disappear, just a couple of notices. So if you've enjoyed today's lecture, do check our events page. We've got some other really interesting lectures coming up. So on the 20th of August, Dr. Christina Welch from the University of Winchester will be talking about sex and death, and she'll be exploring the gender of death through looking at erotic death art. So if you've enjoyed today's talk, do make sure you sign up for that. And do join us next week on Thursday at 1 p.m, where we'll be traveling across Tuscany and northern Italy, looking at churches, bridges and monasteries that were created or refurbished by Matilda of Canossa, one of only 6 women to be buried inside St. Peter's Basilica. So do have a look at our events page. And also do send us messages if you've got any ideas for any topics you think would make a great lecture. Finally, thank you again so much to Emma for taking the time to talk to us today. That really was fascinating. Thank you also to all of you for joining and for your questions. And as we said at the start, please do consider making a donation if you've enjoyed these lectures. But we look forward to seeing you next week. But if you've got any questions, do send us a message. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.